Everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another in-depth deck overview, this time for Rakdos Sacrifice. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer-based deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a comment down below, especially what deck you might like to see us cover next. So we've already kind of covered the Rakdos version of the Sacrifice deck, and some of these Jund decks are very similar to that. The Rakdos Sacrifice deck is very much an engine deck, based largely around Witch's Oven, things like Mayhem Devil, and these different sacrifice things like Cauldron Familiar, Claim the Firstborn, etc. And a lot of them also feature other combo pieces that just depend on what the deck is doing. Sometimes you see cards like Omnicult Anvil, etc. when they really go more in on the engine plan. The Jund deck is a lot like the Rakdos counterpart, except oftentimes you are splashing for Korvold. Korvold is a card that, as you're sacrificing all these permanents, you're gaining an arbitrary amount of card advantage by drawing cards, because whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. This is kind of the go-over-the-top mirror breaker, as well as the things that help you to fight other mid-range and control decks, especially the Rakdos deck that tends to dominate the format. You're still doing a lot of the same things that make the Rakdos deck good, but you have a little bit more power in terms of by splashing the third color. That really breaks down into two variants of Rakdos or Jund. You have the just splashing for Korvold version, and then you have the one that's a little bit more in depth against an actual spread of Jund cards that usually includes Trail of Crumbs and occasionally Gilded Goose. As far as the rest of the deck, you're still doing a lot of the same things. You're doing things like Witch's Oven and Deadly Dispute to sacrifice permanents, and then you're trying to play a bunch of permanents that put multiple pieces in play. Things like Bloodtithe Harvester, things like Fable the Mirror Breaker. All these cards that allow you to sacrifice and gain advantage, and then allow you to trigger Mayhem Devil when you're sacrificing them in the mid to late game. Claim the Firstborn, obviously excellent against creature-based decks. Not that great against control. You often side this out, but it can, in a pinch, give some of your 3 mana and less creatures haste, allow you to maybe punk blue-white control or Rakdos ad nowhere a little bit, and then you're using things like Fatal Push to remove your opponent's problematic creatures. A lot of very powerful creatures are 4 mana or less, and this is one of the best decks at turning on Revolt, although probably not quite as good as its Rakdos counterpart. Bloodtithe Harvester is a card you will see in some of these versions. Both give you an extra aggression as well as a creature that can kill on the battlefield. Fable the Mirror Breaker, obviously very powerful in any of these black-red X mid-range decks. Mayhem Devil, obviously one of the more important cards with all the pinging it does. This is often a must-kill threat for your opponent. And then, you're playing a 3-color mana base. You don't get to play quite as many of the utility lands. You do play things like Den of the Bugbear and such. I have the Eye Tyrant, but you don't get to play quite as many of the utility lands as the Rakdos variant does. As far as the sideboard, things that this version is looking to attack, Leyline of the Void. This is primarily for things like Greasefang and Is It Phoenix, though more definitely is Greasefang, as turn 3 combo decks can be quite annoying. Thoughtseize to disrupt any type of combo decks you might face off against, or control decks. Blue-white control, Lotus Field combo, 5-color Niv. Cards that are highly reliant on one piece of engine. 4th copy of Fatal Push. Obnixilis Adversary, very good in the control matchups. You might bring it in against like red-based burn and such, just gain a little bit of extra life, but this deck is very good at handling most creature-based decks, and decks that are very similar on par. Abrupt Decay for an additional removal spell, and Gigantha the Wellspring is just a nice thing to be able to play with the mana costs you happen to have in your deck. One card that has seen some recent play in these lists is Priest of the Forgotten Gods, which is obviously a nice card advantage engine, way to make your opponent sacrifice creatures, gain a little bit of mana, and draw cards. This version's kind of shied away from that, and another build you used to see is the Bolas' Citadel combo version, which would use things like Catacomb Sifter or I can't remember the other one, Woe Strider, to sacrifice a bunch of permanents to keep scrying, and then try to combo your opponent out with this Citadel of Bolas. Those versions have kind of faded into obscurity a little bit, as this deck has very much become, as the format has become leaner and meaner, this deck has become leaner and meaner as well. When I talked about the actual Jund version, this is what I meant. This is a version that's using things like Gilded Goose. While Gilded Goose isn't the best in terms of producing constant mana, sometimes producing food tokens and having things to sacrifice Witch's Oven is quite nice. Also good against any deck that's trying to arbitrarily aggression you out. Trail of Crumbs is kind of this mid-range and control mirror breaker. Basically allows you, every time you sacrifice a food, that you can pay 1 to look at the top 2 cards of your library and take a permanent from them. And, when you're using things like Witch's Oven and Gilded Goose, and from the Trail of Crumbs itself, oftentimes you're able to go create a bunch of food tokens, and then, you're still splashing Korvold at the top. Things you're giving up things like Unlucky Witness and stuff for this package, but, this is it's much better in the mid-range and control mirrors, which is often where you tend to struggle the most, decks that kind of go over the top of what you're doing. Go blanks for any type of combo and graveyard-based decks. Unlicensed Hearst for any type of graveyard shenanigans, whether it be, Xan Greased Fang, is it Phoenix, any decks, that might be running opposing Cauldron Familiars, all that kind of fun stuff. Damping Sphere, primarily here for Lotus Field, as Lotus Field is a deck that can kind of go over the top of what you're doing and largely doesn't care about your game plan. For final copy of Fatal Push, couple copy of Bone Crusher Giant. I suspect this is more for when you're up against creature decks, or maybe you just need a more powerful standalone threat when your opponent is disrupting your thing. Outline Liberator, which is a nice threat that can also double as enchantment and artifact removal, and that's pretty much this version of the list. One other card that I think is unique, and I have not had an opportunity to test it myself, and that is Weatherlight Complete, which is a 5/5 vehicle that you can't actually crew. But as long as Weatherlight Complete has 4 or more Pheresis counters, it is a Phyrexian creature in addition to its other creature types. So effectively, it's a 2-mana 5/5 flyer. Whenever a creature you control dies, put a Pheresis counter on Weatherlight Completed, then draw a card if it has 7 or more Pheresis counters on it. If it doesn't, scry 1. So this is obviously very powerful as you're sacrificing a bunch of creatures, especially when you pair it with Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven, though a little bit weaker as it does take some time to get rolling. Other sideboard things you might see in this variant, they're a little bit different. Bloody Betrayal, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Tap that creature, gains haste, create a blood token. So this is another way, very similar to Kari's expertise, to take control of more powerful creatures beyond 3 mana that Claim the Firstborn does, while also giving you another blood token to sacrifice to your various effects. Terra Sunder, interesting way to deal with target artifact or enchantments. If the spell was kicked, exile target non-land permanent instead. So, this gives you a way to maybe deal with something like a Hazoret or something that you can't always deal with. And also allows you to, deal with any non-land permanent for a little bit of mana. And then, Unlicensed Hearst, once again, very good against any type of graveyard-based nonsense that you might run into. Final version that we're going to be taking a look at, this is very similar to the Jund version, the second one that we took a look at. You're giving up some of your utility with your Cauldron Familiars to be able to cram these Gilded Gooses and Trail of Crumbs in the thing. But the main card I wanted to take a look at was another card as opposed to Obnixilis that is quite interesting, is Anagrath, which allows you to force your opponent to discard cards. You can gain control of any creature and then untap it, gains haste, sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, has value in mana 3 or later, and then 8, each player loses life equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. So this is another way to attack control decks, as you really don't want to be playing like Liliana of the Veils and such, and discarding cards, because you are very much an engine deck, but it is yet another card that can attack the various go over the top mid-range and control decks. So the part that sets Jund apart from its black range counterpart is the fact that this deck is much better towards dealing with the other mid-range decks. particularly black-red, which it already has a reasonable matchup against, but Korvold is another card that goes to the top of whatever else is doing. And Trail of Crumbs is a card that can even give blue-white control fits. It allows you to kind of play a more pound-for-pound game against the decks that may be able to break apart your engines under other circumstances. This deck is still very good against the creature-based decks. It's a little bit worse against the mana-efficient disruption decks. You know, things like humans and spirits is just a tiny bit worse for the trade-off of being able to play a much better mid-range game against something like Rakdos, 5-color Niv, and things like blue-white control. So basically, you're skewing a little bit away from the aggressive decks, which are typically the bread and butter of these decks, and you're playing a little bit better of a mid-range game with this very powerful card engine that allows you to draw a bunch of cards and kind of kill them quickly if they're not able to answer it. And Korvold is not always the easiest creature to deal with. A lot of the removal in the format simply doesn't deal with it after it comes down and eats something. You know, it comes down and almost automatically has 5 toughness. Things like Heartless Act don't kill it necessarily unless you have it immediately. And obviously things like Dreadbore Liliana can do it, but oftentimes you have a lot of like random Dorkos flying around. You know, your Mayhem Devils, your tokens from Fable, you know, sometimes your various Gilded Geese and Cauldron Familiars you can bring back from the graveyard. So it's not always the easiest for your opponent to kill Korvold once it comes down. And if they don't answer immediately, oftentimes it can take over. But, you know, that said, you are going slightly up the mana curve, so things like mono blue spirits and their disruptive draws can be a little bit more difficult to overcome. So it's kind of a trade-off. You're playing a little bit more powerful of a deck that's a little bit less reliant on its engines, but, you know, still very much synergy-centric for, you know, a slightly better deck in terms of your mid-range and control matchups. Things to attack this deck, you know, Graveyard Hate can obviously be annoying. Things like Leyline of the Void can disrupt your cats. The Hearse isn't the best at disrupting, simply the way Cat Oven is templated. Other cards that can disrupt the graveyard end of it is things like Scavenging Ooze, like Mono Green Aggro. So you have a lot of different things that can disrupt. Things like Rest in Peace can disrupt a lot of your synergies. But, you know, one of the nice things about this version is, you know, with playing Korvold is you're really a bit less reliant on your Cat Oven to close out the game. And you have these more powerful up-the-curve synergies. As far as the deck's place in the meta, I do think it is a little bit better in Rakdos. I've been playing quite a bit of it on Arena and having some success in both best of 1 and best of 3. So it's a deck that can definitely stand the test of time, although I do think they have to be built a little bit differently for the different formats. Obviously best of 1 when you're playing the Explorer format is a little bit more combo and aggro centric, and obviously Rakdos. And the best of 3 version is a little bit more wide open, more akin to the Pioneer format, obviously missing some key decks like Mono Green and Lotus Field combo. But, you know, if you like a deck that has Cat Oven combo, but also can play this game that isn't entirely dependent on its synergies, I would really consider trying this deck out, as it's a lot of fun. But it is definitely a deck you should be aware of, and a deck that I have been remiss for not covering yet. But let me know down in the comments down below what deck you'd like to see us cover next, and hopefully see you soon for another video. This has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG. Hope to see you for the next video.